Okay, guys, it's Mr. Cannon here again. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the Progressive Era, which was an era that was a response to industrialization and the Gilded Age. It was an era that wanted to fix a lot of problems that came about as a result of industrialization, and a lot of those problems that we talked about in the Gilded Age, they're going to try to fix in the Progressive Era. Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, who is in the picture there, he is a perfect example of the progressive era because he's probably the most famous progressive in American history. He was a president, obviously, and we're going to talk about how Roosevelt and others are going to work to change things during this movement in American history. One of the big changes that happened during this era that's going to lead to the progressive era are the changing cities of America. Big cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, they're going to undergo rapid change in the late 1800s thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. We're going to see cities quickly becoming places with these large buildings called skyscrapers. We're going to have lots of work develop in these cities, in the factories of the cities, and because of that, we're going to have large amounts of people flock to the cities for work. Now, when you have large amounts of people coming into one area very quickly, that's going to lead to problems, which we'll look at in a minute. But what I want to talk about now is where those people mainly came from. Obviously, we're going to see migration within America. You're going to have African Americans who are going to start leaving areas of the South to go into cities of the North. A lot of them are looking for work, but certainly they're trying to leave Jim Crow behind as well, and racism and discrimination that's going on in the South. Unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of that continue in the cities of the North. It's not like it's perfect life there. There's still racism and discrimination there. But not only do we see migration within America, but we're going to see immigration to America. Now, prior to 1850, most immigrants to America came from Western and Northern Europe. And of course, England's going to be one of the main places that immigrants come from because that's where the United States came from. They came from England. And so when immigrants came from Western Europe, it didn't really change the culture of America in a major way. But after 1850, during the period we're looking at now, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, most immigrants to America did not come from Western Europe anymore, but came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Places like Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia. We're going to see a large number of immigrants coming from those areas, and they are going to bring with them very different cultures, languages, religions. We're going to see a lot of Orthodox Christians coming during this period. Jewish people are going to come to America during this period, and as they come into America, they're going to bring their own culture with them. And we like to think of America as a melting pot where you have all these different kinds of people, different nationalities and ethnic groups that come together to melt together to form one American culture. But really, in the cities during this period, we didn't see as much of a melting pot as we did a salad bowl, where you did have people living in a city together, but they still formed their own little communities apart from one another. So you would have Chinatown develop, for instance, where it would mainly be Chinese immigrants living there. Little Italy is a perfect example of that. And Little Italy would be Italian immigrants that lived there. And in those communities, you would see, their own foods, and they would speak their own language, and it really would not melt together the way we think of America being a melting pot. So another way to look at it is America was more of a salad bowl. And I think there are different times in our history where we can see both of those things happening. Both the salad bowl theory, which certainly was going on in the cities during this period, and we can see a melting pot theory as well. As time moves on, we see our culture really becoming more united, and there are things that do unite us as an American people, even though we come from all different places. So as our cities began to change dramatically, we're going to see problems emerge, and these problems are going to have to be addressed by the progressive era, and we'll look at that in a minute. A driving force behind a lot of the progressive era reforms are going to be journalists and writers who are referred to as muckrakers. Now, muckrakers were these writers and journalists who wrote articles and books that exposed the corruption of the Gilded Age. They exposed the bad practices of the Industrial Revolution. They exposed things that the government wasn't overseeing. And so these journalists, these muckrakers, really stirred stuff up. That's why they raked the muck, basically. They stirred stuff up to try to get change. There are a lot of muckrakers out there that you can research on your own. The one you must know, and the most famous muckraker, was Upton Sinclair. We talked about him in the Gilded Age unit. Upton Sinclair wrote the book called The Jungle, where he went into the meatpacking plants of Chicago and found just disgusting conditions. He found where there were, rats being poisoned, and instead of throwing the rats away, they would put them in the hoppers with the other meat, and they would be ground up in sausage. He found that even the poisoned bread would be put in the hoppers. That there was no cleanliness. There was no cleanliness in these factories. They would just spit onto the floor where they were walking, and sometimes even the sawdust that they were walking on gets thrown into the hoppers. So it was gross. It was just disgusting conditions. And Upton Sinclair, some people accused him of exaggerating these claims, and maybe there was some exaggeration there, but there was no doubt there needed to be oversight. There needed to be some kind of government regulation of the meatpacking industry. And so Upton Sinclair's work in Chicago, in the Chicago meatpacking industry, is going to lead to change. It's going to lead to government agencies being formed to oversee our food. And this is true of a lot of the muckrakers. A lot of these journalists and writers are going to expose the negative things that bring about change. Without these writers, I don't know how much change would have happened. Because once these writers wrote about these things and the public read them, then of course it's the public that are going to demand the change. And the way things change in America is through the public. The public has to demand it, because we are a government of the people, and that's how it works. So the muckrakers did a very important job of exposing these things so that the public would understand them. That's why it's so important to have a free press in America. It's so important to have that anywhere, that you have a media that is free to report what they need to report and what they want to report. And it's also important that they report things that are true. Because if you can't trust your press, then you can't hold your government accountable, because you just don't believe what the press is reporting. We're seeing that a little bit in America today. You have a lot of people that just don't trust the press. So even if they're reporting true things, a lot of people say, well, they've reported false things before, so I don't believe them now. That's why the muckrakers, though, were so effective, because the people trusted them. One of the unique aspects of the progressive era is that it's one of the first time that we see women taking the lead in a lot of these reforms in society. Women are really going to be stepping out during the progressive era and leading or championing a lot of these changes that are going to take place. And there are a lot of different movements we can talk about within the progressive era. We have to start with the suffrage movement, though. During this period, even though we talk about women taking the lead, before the 19th Amendment, women couldn't even vote. So that's going to be one of the first things that they champion and had been championing for a while, is the passage of an amendment that would grant women the right to vote. It would be a constitutional right to vote. Now, there were some places in America where women had already been granted that right. For instance, some of the states out in the western part of the country gave women the right to vote well before some of the states in the eastern part of the country did. So just because we didn't have a 19th Amendment yet, just because it wasn't legal everywhere, didn't mean that women couldn't vote anywhere, because there were places they could vote prior to the 19th Amendment. But what women really wanted to see was a constitutional amendment giving them the right to vote everywhere in America. There's speculation that the reason some of the western states allowed it before the eastern states is because women were so important in the pioneer movement, and seeing the pioneers move out west, they took such a lead out there that they gained respect of people out in the west, and because of that, western states gave them the right to vote first. I don't know if that's true, but that makes a little bit of sense. But in the end, women are going to fight for that right to vote. Two of the famous champions of that movement are Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. They're really going to force basically the government, Congress, to make a move and pass an amendment. And ultimately, they're going to get that support to pass that amendment, and the 19th Amendment is going to be passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote in America. Despite that, there are still going to be issues in America for women. Despite getting the right to vote, we're going to see very few women actually run for office. We're going to see very few women receive equal treatment in the workplace, equal pay in the workplace. Most women didn't work outside the home anyway, but for those that did, they were not treated equally in the workplace. So there were still a lot of there still was a lot of progressive things that needed to happen for women even after they gained the right to vote. Another lady that you need to know is Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams was very important in the progressive era because she championed the rights of immigrants and the rights of children. Let's start with immigrants. Jane Addams opened a settlement house in Chicago called the Hull House. And the Hull House basically took in these immigrants. It allowed them to take vocational classes by giving babysitting to their children, so they were able to go take vocational classes while receiving child care. And in taking those vocational classes, they're going to get better jobs because of that. So immigrants are going to benefit directly from Jane Addams' work. So she really helped immigrants get a foothold in America through that Hull House. She's also going to champion children's rights. You know, we didn't have child labor laws back then. And so Jane Addams was really going to push for laws to be put in place protecting children in the workplace. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in the next slide. Two other areas where women are going to take the lead and really push for reform are in the area of child labor and in the area of banning alcohol. Let's look at child labor first. Okay, so we didn't have any child labor laws nationally in America during this period. And because of that, we had children being basically forced by their families who needed the money, being forced to work in these factories. But these factories were unsafe. If you look at the picture down there on the bottom right, that you got these kids there. You can tell they're not very old, maybe 8, 9 years old. They're barefoot. That one kid is barefoot on the machines. You know, they got their hands up there. And as a result of that, we would see accidents all the time, especially involving children, where they would get fingers cut off and toes cut off. And it was just not a safe place to be. On top of that, kids were working way too many hours and were getting very little pay for it. You know, a child cannot work the same amount of hours as an adult, and yet they were working those hours during this period. And as a result of that, you're going to see women really start to push for changes in that system. They're going to push the government to really make rules for these factories, not where kids can't work in them anymore, because during this period we didn't see child labor end, but we did start to see laws, especially at the state level, being pushed to make it safer for kids and to shorten the amount of hours they could work. Ultimately, we're going to find national laws on child labor as well, but the first national laws on child labor get thrown out by the courts. Later, we're going to have other laws that develop after the progressive era that are going to be put into place. And today, you know, we have a lot of child labor laws where it makes it illegal for children to work pretty much in a lot of these situations. Another aspect of the progressive era that women took the lead on was the Prohibition movement. Now, one of the first organizations to push for prohibition was called the Women Christians Temperance Movement. It was both a women's movement and it was made up of Christian women. So it was a religious movement as well. Temperance meaning the banning, basically not using alcohol. That's what temperance means, is that you don't use alcohol. And the reason women take the lead on that issue is because women were really suffering from alcoholism in America. The late 1800s was a very rough period in American history for alcohol. People were abusing it, especially men, and because women didn't work outside the home, they relied on men to bring in money. And if men are abusing alcohol, they're not out working like they should and bringing in the money they should. And of course, in some situations, it led to even abuse. So women are really going to see alcoholism affect their day-to-day lives because the men in their lives were abusing this alcohol. So they're going to push for laws at the state level and the local level banning alcohol. And we're going to see a lot of states ban alcohol well before we have an amendment banning it nationally. Now, this goes back to federalism, guys. We need to talk about that one more time. Federalism is the sharing of power between the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. So just because there wasn't a federal law banning alcohol didn't mean there weren't state laws. There were. So a lot of states had already banned alcohol. South Carolina did not do that initially, but other states did. But eventually these progressives, these women especially, are going to push for an amendment banning alcohol all over the country. Their view was that it was so dangerous that we needed to ban alcohol everywhere, not just at the state level, but at the national level. So the 18th Amendment is going to be passed, banning the sale and use of alcohol. You can see there in the photo up above, you can see them opening the barrels of alcohol and pouring it down the drain, and you see a government official and a police officer overlooking that. That was their way of saying this is the law now and we're going to enforce it. The 18th Amendment was ineffective. You know, during this period, we see the rise of speakeasies, which were these underground bars, underground meaning secretive. They were these secretive bars, and it became a very corrupt system where the law enforcement would be paid off to look the other way. This is where we see the rise of the mob. The mafia really gets its start bootlegging alcohol and selling it illegally. And so eventually, after about 15 or so years of attempting prohibition in America, we got rid of the 18th Amendment. And the only way to get rid of an amendment is with another amendment. So the 21st Amendment gets rid or repeals the 18th Amendment. But it's important to note that even though prohibition did not work, women were absolutely right that there was an issue in America with alcohol. And too many Americans were abusing it. A lot of people look at America today and say we're going through another era where alcohol is being abused at a high level. You'll have to decide that for yourself. But what we do know is that prohibition is not an effective way to deal with that. There are other ways to deal with the abuse of alcohol. Okay, so it's important to point out again, while the most famous progressives were progressive presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt on the right, and Woodrow Wilson on the left, that there were progressives at the local and state level as well. Federalism is the sharing of power between the federal, state, and local governments. So there were progressives in all levels of government. But of course, the most famous progressives are going to be those presidents, the progressives that are on the national stage. And the most famous by far is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt actually came to power pretty quickly. He was a war hero in the Spanish-American War, and as a war hero, he's going to end up becoming vice president of the United States. And when William McKinley is assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt quickly becomes the president. On the assassination of McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. At the time, he was by far the youngest president in America. He's still one of the youngest presidents in American history. But Teddy Roosevelt in power is going to transform the system in dramatic ways. He's going to try to limit these monopolies. He's going to be known as a trust buster because he does go after the monopolies in America. He's also going to be a champion of laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. So Roosevelt's going to push for laws basically helping our food make sure that it's safe. Of course, that's in response to The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair. Roosevelt's going to promote conservation of natural resources by creating national parks. He's a big player in the creation of a lot of our national parks. And he's actually going to create a party. It's a temporary party. It didn't last very long, but it was called the Bull Moose Party, which was a progressive party seeking to change a lot of things in America. So if Roosevelt is the most famous progressive, Woodrow Wilson, the man there on the left, is probably the second most famous progressive president. And it's going to be Woodrow Wilson, who not only was president during World War I, but domestically is going to push through things like the Clayton Antitrust Act which helps to bust up more of those monopolies. In fact, one of the most famous workers' rights person in America called it the Magna Carta of labor. Basically, it was such an important document. It was like the Magna Carta of labor, of workers. It allowed unions to be exempt from antitrust laws. He's going to push for the 16th Amendment, which is going to create a progressive income tax. The 17th Amendment, which provides for the direct election of senators. Before this period, senators were appointed. Now they're going to be elected. And it was Woodrow Wilson's administration that passed the first Child Labor Act. So these two men are going to be very influential in really changing the culture and country during this period. It's also going to be during this period we're going to see the Federal Reserve Act created, where we basically create a system that is going to control how much money is printed or how much little money is printed. So all that's going to happen during the Progressive Era as well. Another big reform we're going to see during the Progressive Era is that of election reform. Now, during the Gilded Age, during the late 1800s, we had these political machines rising up in all parts of America, especially in the cities, that were in many cases just corrupt. And these political machines, all they are organizations that were used to get people elected through legal means in some cases and illegal means in other cases. They would use bribes and threats to get people to vote for them. They would target immigrants. A lot of the immigrants coming into the cities needed jobs, and so this political machine would have connections with industries and factories, and they would say, okay, we will get you these workers, and we'll make sure, you got to make sure these workers are going to vote for us, and if you get your workers to vote for us, then we will scratch your back, basically. We'll look out for your industry. And that's how political machines often operated. Back then, there was no secret ballot, so you actually knew how people voted because they had to put their ballot in the correct box. And because of that, a lot of these immigrants had no choice but to vote the way the machine wanted them to vote. They needed a job, after all, so they would do whatever it took to get a job. Now, it wasn't like all political machines were abusing these immigrants and just using them. In many cases, they did favors for immigrants, and immigrants were more than happy to vote for these political machines. But there was no doubt that the political machines were out for themselves. They were out to get elected, and as long as they were getting elected, they were fine helping these immigrants. But if, at any point, if they didn't need the immigrants anymore, then they wouldn't have cared about them so much. So we need to be clear about that. Some of the reforms that are going to happen during this period to limit the strength of these machines are the secret ballot and the 17th Amendment. So what the secret ballot does is it keeps your vote secret. Okay, so now, unless you tell someone who you vote for, no one will ever know. Now, that's important because that means your employer can't hold who you vote against you. That means a political machine can't, use threats and bribery anymore because they wouldn't know who you voted for anyway. You could take their money and still vote the way you wanted to vote. The 17th Amendment is important because that allowed for the direct election of senators. Before this period, senators were appointed by state legislatures. So they really weren't answerable to the people. If I can't vote for my senator, why does he even care what I'm saying to him about a particular issue? The only thing he has to worry about is the state legislature. But the 17th Amendment is going to change that. The 17th Amendment made it where we, the people, vote for our two senators. So our senators in South Carolina, Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham, we voted them into office. And that was an important change during this period, during the Progressive Era. And it's going to help to make the system a little less corrupt. Not that it's still not corrupt today, but it's less corrupt than it was. Another example of reforms we're going to see during this period are in the area of cities. We're going to see huge problems rising up as cities are going to get bigger during this period. Okay, during the era of the Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, we're going to see cities start to look like they do today. Giant skyscrapers are going to be built. People are going to flood to the cities for work, for jobs, and so cities are going to be getting bigger. But with those changes, inadvertently, it wasn't on purpose, but they're going to lead to problems. Cities weren't ready to deal with the massive amounts of people moving in there. And so we're going to have issues with sanitation. We're going to have sewage still in parts of the cities in the streets, which leads to disease. That's not good. Trash. We didn't have trash service in the cities, so trash will be sitting out. We didn't have fire departments that were effective to put out fires. They have housing issues. That on the right, you see that photograph is of what we call a tenement apartment building, and basically these were these tiny rooms, these tiny apartments where you would have, in some cases, 10, 12 people living in a tiny space. And they would share a bathroom, and it wouldn't be everybody in the apartment building would share a bathroom maybe down the hall. And the facilities weren't good. It led to diseases really spreading very quickly. And so we're going to have to do something about the tenement houses and these tenement apartments. And then one of the last issues is, of course, crime is going to go up during this period, and we're going to need better police forces to deal with it. And it's going to be during this period we see really professional police forces develop fully and do the job that they do today. One way we can combat all of these things during this period, the progressives are going to push through things people called city planners and engineers. Engineers are good at building things and developing things. And so these city planners are going to plan out cities. They're going to use the engineers to give them ideas for how best to lay things out. And they're going to be hired in cities to make them better and safer. And that's absolutely what happens. Once we get these city planners and engineers working in the cities, we see the death rates in cities go down. During the Gilded Age, if you lived in the country in a rural area, you actually lived a good bit longer. Your life expectancy was maybe 5 to 10 years longer than a person who lived in New York or Philadelphia or Boston or Chicago. But after the city reforms come in, now you don't see a difference. You didn't see a difference between those who lived in cities and those who lived in rural areas as far as their life expectancy. You could live just as long. And so that was a very, very important part of the progressive era. Another thing we need to talk about with the progressive era is the breaking up of monopolies. You can see there in the political cartoon, that is Theodore Roosevelt, that's Teddy Roosevelt, and you can see there he's using the big stick there to knock down these monopolies, big oil, big coal, you can see there. And one of the ways he's going to do that is by pushing through laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act. What the Sherman Antitrust Act did was it gave Roosevelt the permission to regulate corporations and break up monopolies. Where he saw a monopoly developing, he could break it up. And so today, we really don't have monopolies. The last issue, big issue I can remember having with this in America was Microsoft back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the government really came after them and told them that they were going to break them up. And so we saw Microsoft actually pour money into a competitor, Apple, so that they wouldn't be broken completely up. And so that's what we're going to see during this period, is Roosevelt really going after some of these big corporations who had become monopolies. Now, the truth of what was going on during this period is that not all monopolies were touched. Just like in every situation, Roosevelt and other politicians went after some, and then others who maybe scratched their back, maybe gave them enough money, they weren't targeted as strongly as other groups were. But there's no doubt this was a positive development for the consumer, for us. It was very positive that these monopolies are going to be broken up, because we're going to see service get better and prices go down with competition. Competition is good. There are a whole host of other progressive measures that we need to mention. We'll go through them rather quickly here. The 16th Amendment was a progressive measure. It's going to create a progressive income tax, the kind of tax system we have today. The 16th Amendment is going to pass that kind of tax system where basically you are taxed based on how much you make every year. So if you make $1 million, the percentage of money that you're taxed is higher than a person who makes $15,000 a year. And that's called the progressive income tax system. A lot of people look at the 16th Amendment and say, I hate that amendment. That's the amendment that gave us income tax. And I completely understand that. But that's how our system works today. And that's what you need to understand is that the more you make, the more you're going to pay in taxes. It's not just the more you're going to pay, the higher percentage of your salary you're going to pay in taxes. Also during this period, we're going to see the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act lead to the first oversight over our food supply. You know, one of the things that we can all agree on is that we need safe food, we need safe drink, and we need to be able to be sure that what we're purchasing is not going to make us sick. And so the first organizations or agencies that are going to develop to oversee our food is going to be during this period with the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Today, if you go to the supermarket and you buy meat, for instance, all of our meat has to be stamped USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. That ensures that it's been inspected by someone in the government and that it's not going to make us sick. And if we do have a situation where food gets out that is not safe, then the government's able to track it relatively easily and keep it from spreading and hurting more people than it already did. We're also going to see the creation of the Federal Reserve during this period. You know, one of the things that the populace had complained about was the gold standard, the idea that all of our money had to be backed by gold. Well, one of the progressive measures is going to fix that by creating the Federal Reserve. And what the Federal Reserve does, one of the things it does, is control our money supply. The Federal Reserve determines how much money we print or how much little money we print. And it's based on how inflation and deflation. We don't want our money supply to be, if we have too much money in the system, then the money's not worth as much. That's called inflation. If we had too little, then it's worth more, but we don't have enough to go around, and so that's called deflation. And so we want to be somewhere in the sweet spot, and that's what one of the jobs of the Federal Reserve is to figure out what that sweet spot actually is. We're also going to see more credit available to farmers during this period so that they can go out and purchase land and equipment. So this is going to be an era that we're going to see try to help our farmers. And then we're going to see the creation, in some cases, of an 8-hour workday. That doesn't mean that every industry was limited to 8 hours, but some industries were limited to working their employees 8 hours a day. And if they worked them any more than that, they had to pay them overtime, which is more money. It's time and a half. They make times and a half what they normally make. And so these rules are going to be put into place during the progressive measures. So basically what we're going to see is the country looking more like it does today as far as a work schedule does. It didn't happen overnight. It's not like this happened with one law or two laws. We're going to see over time it get more and more progressive measures to limit the workday. But these are all important measures that happened during this period. And overall, when we look at the progressive era, we're going to see it was a time when society looked at the future and said, okay, where are we going? What are the problems associated with the advancement of technology, with the advancement of industry, and how can we fix them? We already know some of the problems that exist. We need to fix those. Well, what about problems in the future? We need to think about them in advance. And that's what the progressive era was all about. Some of the things that were attempted during the progressive era were very successful, and other things that were attempted during the progressive era were not as successful. And we know, like prohibition, that was not successful during this period. But many of the things that they tried were successful, and that's why the progressive era is so important.